everyone. I am Alec Plord. I am a first-year CBM.
And I'm Sophie Lichtman. I'm a first-year XD.
That does not sound right.
No, Sophie, it does not. And that's because we just told you some lies, which is what these two creatives who are going to talk to you today did an entire campaign trying to combat.
Right. These two brand center grads worked together on the New York Times Truth campaign.
Yep, where Tim Gordon came to Droga5.
We rehearsed, I swear.
Tim Gordon came to Droga5 just 2 years after it was formed in 2008 as one of its first creatives and has worked on brands such as Puma, Under Armour, and Chase. Just last week, he went from ECD in the New York office to a co-CCO.
And Nick Maschmeyer went to Droga5 in 2012. He's now a group strategy director working on hilarious brands like Mailchimp and Dos Equis, and of course the Newcastle If We Made It campaign.
Yup. And beyond winning just countless awards, these two are a great example of rising through the ranks while sticking at one agency.
So with that, let's welcome back our brand fam, Tim Gordon and Nick Maschmeyer.
Hi, thanks for having us back.
Yeah.
I have to say, though, first and foremost, this is far nicer accommodations than when we were here. And that's not a knock against the other parts of ECU. They're lovely and they all have their purpose, but in my mind, I remember this starting far earlier and also feeling far colder. So it's really nice to be back in a warm, lovely wooded place. I just sound like that guy who's like, I walked uphill 2 ways to school.
So my father.
Yeah. Exactly.
So a little bit about us. Thank you for reading our bios. Here's a longer form version of it. We just wanted to include embarrassing photos of us while we were at Brand Center. Was it called Ad Center when you were here?
It was. I was the last. I was the transition.
He looks the same. I think the cardigan's gone, but there's a lot of alumni that we still see in New York and are killing it in the industry. But yeah, this was a long time ago. You want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. That's my bio. These were, photos from both years when I sort of came to grips with the fact that I can't actually wear a cardigan. And where we also did some really interesting things. With a former professor, Charles, we did an art exhibit in sort of near Shockoe Bottom, and that's graduation, but that's not actually my dad. That's just a friend's dad. I don't know why. And this is us apparently having a really good time. Funny enough, Casey and Karen, Casey just left, but Karen works with us at Droga5, and Nick Kaplan is a group creative director at 72 and Sunny in New York. So we haven't strayed far from each other. This is Nick?
Yeah, this is me. I really went through a metamorphosis over my 2 years here. This is, I think Chris Colleton's brother might be in the audience today. He's the one in the robot suit. That was my iPal for the talent show. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, our 2 years here, and I really cherish it and helped us get where we are today. We want to show just a little bit of a sizzle about Droga5 before we get into the New York Times work. So here it is.
The pages of the book have been showing up all over the country.
There is video making its way around the web right now that appears to show
the video artist Mark on spray painting the side of Air Force One.
The Air Force actually sent to see whether the plane had been vandalized.
Battle lamps, party sharks, friendship.
Nobody has ever seen anything like this.
Time for the Great Schlep. The Great Schlep.
The Great Schlep.
Great Schlep.
Great Schlep.
Local restaurants are chipping in to provide safe drinking water for children around the world. It's called the TAP Project.
This is the biggest project in the 70s. It is truly the first sunrise of the next phase of your life.
Honey Babe, we're unafraid to sell the products and commercials showing same-sex parents.
Goodbye.
then why don't you just go work there?
Pancake flavored beer.
Oh, Uber, I like sausage.
Yep, Wolf comes in and says, how'd you learn to talk to animals? And I said, books. And we had a good laugh about that.
There's a news reporter down there, she's going blah, 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 big car chase.
That's an Italian sausage commercial.
Robin Hood and Little John walking through the forest, laughing back.
Let me get them all. Let me get them all. Shut it Australia.
Brian done it? Yep. Really?
Yeah.
Wait, hold on. This isn't a movie. No. It's a tourism ad for Australia.
This is some of human being. Human being.
I have got you home.
No, you stop flirting with me. You started it.
Mama said knock you out.
I just want to say two quick things before we get into this. One, Jerry is here, an alumni from Droga, who some of his work is there. So, hi, buddy. Second, and this is also sort of me just practicing out a little bit of my new role. So bear with me for a second. One of the things I think we talk a lot about at Droga specifically is there is no house style, and that's sort of evident in the work that you see on the screen. But it's something that we really sort of aspire to as creatives. And that just means that like from the top levels down, the leadership, they all flexed in different ways. So we can go from the dumbest thing in the world to the most beautiful thing in the world. And no matter which way we go, it will always be done with a level of craft and humility and consideration. So I think it's something that as an agency we aspire to, and we also aspire to hire and look to people who feel that they can maybe have a strong suit, but are open to, or at least looking at, like expanding the way that they flex creatively. So anyways, that's a bit about us as well, but this is why we're here. So, the New York Times.
Yeah, not the dumbest thing in the world.
No.
So a little bit, we want to take you on the journey of sort of our entire relationship with the New York Times. A little bit of context, they hadn't done a brand campaign in something like 15 or 50 years. They were just, the New York Times. They didn't necessarily need to do anything like that. But following the election in 2017, they came to us and say, we want to make a big statement about the role of journalism, about our journalism in particular, and start a conversation about the role of truth in society, because it seemed like it was being devalued, undermined, in a lot of ways, whether it's fake news or shouting, enemy of the people. Lots of things were conspiring against a legacy newspaper, 160 some odd year old company whose only mission is to bring you the truth, right? That's their product at the end of the day. It's not newspapers, it's not ad sales, it is truth. Journalism and reporting is their vehicle for that. We want to start, so that being their product, it's not credit cards, it's not sneakers. When you're a brand that stands for something as sort of simple and conceptual at the same time as truth, you can go a lot of ways. So just want to do like a little exercise. Like, how would you fill in the blank in this sentence? The truth hurts. Hurts. What else? The truth will set you free. That's exactly right. What else?
I think someone said saves.
The truth saves.
Which I like.
Yeah. What else? Anything else? It certainly matters. The answer is it's all of these things. The truth can flex in a lot of ways. So what this is really about is how do you build a sort of dimensional, dynamic brand with a very simple but very conceptual idea like truth. What do you say about truth? It can turn into manifesto territory really quick and a love letter to truth and all of that, but this is a business, and we wanted to be able to say something about truth and its role in society while building a 21st century business that happens to be 160 years old. Like I mentioned before, the New York Times has a really simple mission. It's not about subscriptions, it's not about selling papers, it's not about ad sales, it's not about clicks. They seek the truth and help people understand the world. They do it for people, and they do it through truth. They truly believe in that mission. You can feel it internally. We go up there probably once a week. And there's just sort of a reverence, like a hushed reverence as you walk around the halls of that building. It's these people who dedicate their lives to seeking the truth and delivering it to people and helping people get a better sense of their world and understand it more deeply, which is a really, really powerful mission. They hold themselves to the highest standards, like a medical doctor would or like a lawyer would, the Hippocratic Oath and all of that. They have scruples, they have a set of standards that they live by, and they don't deviate from it at all. The truth, you can finish that sentence in a lot of ways, but we were really focused on what the truth has the power to do, and why they believe in the truth and why they've made it the cornerstone of their mission. And that's simply that the truth holds power to account. Powerful institutions are held in check, but when you seek the truth. They give voice to the voiceless, so they tell stories from all around the world that would otherwise not get told because it doesn't make for a clickable headline, or for whatever reasons they don't have the time, resources, or reporters on the ground. But the New York Times actively seeks out these stories because they believe deeply that these stories need to be told. It promotes understanding between people of different backgrounds. So common ground is what truth can be a lot, where you can have dialogue and conversations, even if you have no other frame of reference. If you start with the truth, that is a good place to start. And sort of more in a loftier way, the truth is the lifeblood of democracy. It really is. Free markets couldn't exist, capitalism couldn't exist, free and fair elections could not exist unless journalism and quality journalism, high quality journalism existed. It really has the power to affect real change in the world. And the New York Times, to find the truth, they're not sitting in a tower in Times Square. They have boots on the ground. They have reporters and desks all over the world, local reporters, international reporters, specific beat reporters. They have so many verticals, so many desks, so many initiatives. It's a worldwide network of people, photographers, editors, fact checkers. They all work together to pursue and report and publish 70,000 stories every year, 70,000 stories. When you look at the Sunday Times, it is a work of art. It really is. I mean, it's insane. The number of original stories that they're reporting in just one edition of the Sunday Times that becomes trash the next day, essentially. Hopefully recycling. Well, recycling. And not trash. I mean, not without love. You place it gently in the recycling bin. It really is astounding, and it's rarer and rarer for that to exist.
Yeah. So I think obviously very lofty, very important, very sort of impactful goals and a set of standards at which they held them to. And when you're given that, when you're sort of asked to take this on, you sort of start with besides just sort of like screaming into a pillow, you get this to a question like this. So what do you do with that? And I can remember, you'll see a tweet in a minute. I went to the Times in the fall of 2016, sort of right around December. And it was weird. It really did feel a little bit like there had been a death. And not because of the outcome of the election. Listen, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, and within the New York Times there is diverse opinions across political spectrums. But more just in the fact there was a real reckoning that they had got something wrong, and that they had missed something, and that they actually hadn't been able to deliver what they needed to do for the American public. So you could feel it. You could feel it when you went there. And they asked us, if you pull up the next slide, how do you, this is gonna go terribly wrong. Sorry, should have got the laugh. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with this when this is the person who just won and is in charge? And when not only the New York Times, but sort of the idea of truth and the idea of a sort of fourth estate is under attack. And when sort of, and we saw it, when lies spread twice as fast as the truth. When fake news spreads farther, deeper, faster, than anything. We're seeing this more and more now even, than we did in 2016. I think in 2016, we were probably naive about how dangerous this was. A classic. This is both hilarious and the most scariest thing of all time. This was the most shared Facebook post, right?
I think it was Facebook.
Or it was a tweet, regardless,
Yeah.
of the 2016 election cycle. So literally the most shared thing that, like, if you had to make a bet on what got the most impressions, the most eyeballs, it was this blatant lie, that the Pope had endorsed Trump for president. So, as I mentioned, what do you do when the very need for professional journalism is being questioned? And when it faces sort of a worldwide crisis? The Guardian, which loves to sort of trade in hyperbole, even though they are a fantastic newspaper, sort of called it the dark age. You fight back. And you don't fight back just by being insolent. You fight back by giving people hope, and you fight back in a myriad of ways. I think when we talked about what we set out to do from the very beginning, there was a brief that came in from the strategy team that was, in a world of easy lies, we go after the hard truth. And that sort of became our lighthouse for what we wanted to do. And in a way, what we set out to do was actually be a lighthouse, not only just for America and readers, but for journalism as an institution, so that in a sort of, when you're lost at sea, and apology for all the metaphors, but when you're lost at sea and you don't know where to turn, and it is more and more complicated, and your aunt is telling you that so-and-so did this, and your uncle is telling you so-and-so this, and TikTok is telling you something. I don't know what it does. You can turn to the Times, and you can turn to journalism to have a better understanding. So that's how we decided to fight back. And what we're going to take you through is sort of a real exercise in finding a very simple, creative device and really showing the flex that it can be applied across a huge amount of different verticals and periods of time and issues and intentions. So we started in 2017 around the Oscars with a very sort of simple message that the truth is more important now than ever. This was sort of our initial rallying cry. This was a sort of acknowledgement that both it was hard but worth fighting for. And this was sort of, as Nick mentioned, honestly the first brand campaign that the New York Times had done, probably actually much longer than 15 years, like 50 years. Like they really hadn't done one. So this was a big step for them. This was immensely scary for them as well. You have to remember that journalists aren't really in the business of talking about themselves. It's not something that they strive to do. I think they're happiest behind a byline. So this was sort of a whole thing that was, both important for the company, but also in a way like important for the journalists who are working for the Times to feel as if they were being backed, that they could be proud of what they were doing, that what they were doing was important. And so I think this was, funny enough, we talk about this a lot with David Rubin, who's the CMO of the Times. This was a campaign for the world and for the Times. And I think that's something to keep in mind. It started very simply. It was a simple sort of statement done in a way that we felt was analogous to the institution and was sort of shared the art direction cues of the paper itself. And it had a very simple film that...
The game plan is clearly to attack the press and hope
this is the case study.
from reporting the facts.
I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news.
His administration refused to allow several reporters into an on-the-record session.
The New York Times is coming out with a new national ad campaign this weekend. It asks this question: how do we arrive at the truth?
So part of the Oscar moment that has everybody talking this morning wasn't even part of the show.
Take a quick look at this commercial.
The truth is our nation is more divided than ever.
Alternative facts are just ways to read something.
The truth is, everyone took this on. We need to put the safety defense of their reporting, it's just a defense of reporting.
President Trump reacted to it on Twitter, writing, "The failing New York Times will take an ad, a bad one, to help save its failing reputation."
There's a giant billboard on top of the New York City parking lot terminal.
The ad's message is that the truth is more important now than ever.
This ad is designed to get you to go online, sign up for the New York Times, and defend truth. The New York Times is releasing their first TV commercial in years.
Trump is a climate change denier. Trump is a bully. He is America's gullible uncle.
If you work for anything with the word Times in it, I'd like to ask you to leave the building right now, okay?
The New York Times is experiencing a surge in subscriptions because there is a demand for truth.
In fact, our digital subscriptions are going through the roof. Even print subscriptions are up.
Our world is not accept easy answers.
An hour from now, a rally in support of a free press is set to start in Manhattan.
Truth is hard to reveal.
Our mission is to find the truth.
And it's funny that this was done a couple years ago. So we were just talking about the subscriptions are now, and you have to remember, and we'll get into this some more. It's like the ad revenue is plummeting, and that's not for any fault of the New York Times in general. It's just that it's the case of the business, and it's funny enough actually. Online advertising is up, but the sort of the way that it's paid for and the sort of frequency means it actually can't even counteract this sort of decline in print subscriptions. So
it's up overall. It's down in journalism, newspapers, that sort of stuff. It's being hoovered up by the Googles, Facebooks, Twitters of the world. Yeah.
So the point, it is a subscription-based model. That's the only way this is going to sustain. And if you have to think about, you got 70,000 stories. It's arguably the New York Times is the most expensive form of journalism that you will get, in the sense of the most money goes into the Sunday Times and to the website and onto the page. So your subscription dollars, for any of you who do subscribe or use your parents' login, thank you. It does matter because, having spent a lot of time with these people, this is what allows them to get on a plane and go to Myanmar, or what allows them to, subpoena Trump's taxes, or to follow a lead which may lead nowhere, and gets to sort of spyware. So again, subscriptions are now close to 3.5 digital, which is amazing.
Yeah, and it's the majority of their revenue, which didn't always used to be the case. Yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, we can both do this. We're going to mumble over each other at some point, so we might as well start doing it now.
Yeah.
What was cool about this was, I think, again, it's very easy to sort of post-rationalize things, but I think one thing that we were very considerate about was making this a simple campaign at the beginning, and something that really people could rally around. And I think if you do that, I think if you sort of find something that you can really believe in and something that you can craft and make beautiful, it does have consequence, and it does merit taking the time, because when you do that, I think you can enter culture. And we saw that with the Times. The shirt actually became like a badge of honor. It was for sale. We did partnerships with Everlane around climate change, and when it even became like a high fashion statement, and was being sold for far more than any of us can afford.
We didn't get any swag.
But it is, this is like the true test. At Droga, we talk about peddling influence and impact, and this is a true case study of us at our best. This is seeing something that we believe in, that we believe in the company, finding its way into culture beyond just the trade press. And then it became a protest refrain. Not only did the campaign become sort of a form of protest for some people, literally subscribing to the Times did the same. So, that was sort of a movement in support of an era where there was easy lies.
Yeah.
We then wanted to sort of show who was sort of behind all of this, and this was our first foray into telling stories of journalists. And this was done a couple years ago with Darren Aronofsky.
Yeah. We made a big, bold statement, and we wanted to follow it up with, again, taking something quite simple like truth and dimensionalizing it. So reframing the focus from the concept of truth and starting a conversation about that to really digging into and hearing from the people who go find it. Some of these are, this is a warning, some of the footage is a little upsetting. Probably it'll be the only upsetting thing of all the films, but there is some footage in the next couple of ones that might be challenging.
I see fear. I see desperation. But I also see hope. Thousands of people riding every day. Just think about how bad it must be in their country that they would take their families, their children, put them on a raft that barely floats, risking their lives to find a place to live and find a place to be accepted. When you find it, you recognize it, and that's when you really start pressing shutter. I feel it's important to take photographs that are going to make a difference. I'm Tyler Hicks, photojournalist for the New York Times.
A couple other things that sort of mentioned. One, if anyone has trouble with the blinking, there's two more. But no, I mean, I would say it in all seriousness because it was an intentional thing, but it's the one thing just for the craft, for those who are sort of interested in all this stuff. Every one of those photos was actually the photo that was sort of surrounding the photo that ran. So if you can think of them almost in the sense of like film strips, it was the photos that were before and after, and in almost every case, every photo that sort of led up to the photo that ran. I think the other thing that was important, and Nick mentioned, was it gave us an opportunity in our first way to sort of hear from the journalists and to be allow them to tell their story of why they do it, and as I mentioned before, encourage them to not be boastful for the sake of it and not be braggadocious, but to sort of be prideful about what they're doing because it does have importance. These photos of Tyler Hicks, took, some cynics may say they didn't make a difference, but they really did bring a ton of attention to the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. So I thought that was also worth mentioning.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the music at the end, the piano?
Yes. Oh yeah, there's subtle branding things throughout that I should draw out. I think one of the things we wanted to talk about and in this is, again, it goes back to my idea, the idea of simplicity, and we'll get to the sort of like takeaway, but this idea that a simple idea can be dynamic, and that you'll notice, hopefully, or at least feel that throughout all the work, there is actually a lot of rigor and constriction placed on everything, and in the sense of only using elements that have sort of in some way actually been in the New York Times, and also using art direction that is only sort of inspired or actually sort of ripped from the pages of the New York Times or the website. And also sonically, the piano as a device that, it's funny, you never like get into advertising to be like, I want to make an audio sting. But it was something that came about in the first campaign. It was something that to punctuate the sort of the cacophony of chatter, and it's something that actually we found has become really sort of emblematic of the New York Times now, and the idea that the piano sort of hits with each sort of message of the sort of troika at the end was something that we've looked to carry through all of them.
Should we see two more?
Yeah.
We spent almost the entirety of the next 10 hours under fire. Our vehicle got progressively less drivable. Everybody was very focused, looking out the window. Being outside of a vehicle was suicide. I heard somebody scream in airbags, "Sierra Mafaka," which means Louis trapped car. I felt the explosion directly in front of me. I thought a lot about the person in that car. I wish I could have talked to him to understand who he was. Trying to imagine that without anger or disgust is part of our job as journalists too. New York Times. There was blood coming out of people's eyes. I'd never covered anything like this. A conflict that was invisible, felt powerless. The virus was destroying them from the inside out. So I had to be close. It is a responsibility as a journalist to show the rest of the world what's happening, to do the story justice, to do the people justice. I'm Daniel Berger, photojournalist for the New York Times.
So with all of that, so that was sort of like the V2 of the first, sort of in a world of easy lies, the truth is hard to find. And, we demonstrated it through our reporters because those are quite difficult situations to be in and things to cover and do it objectively and do it humanely and do it all for truth. Again, going back to the theme of this presentation, which is simplicity, a very single-mindedness creates a certain dimensionality or dynamism to your brand. We wanted to explore other ways of talking about truth and what it can mean. And I think, I just sort of thought of this while we were talking, but what we did is there was a lot of almost like deconstructing the product itself. So in the next ones, you'll see a bit of wordplay from the headline. You'll see bylines and the lead stories, the lead sentences from a smattering of articles, and then you'll see comprehensiveness of coverage, like longitudinally, over time, over something that's really important, but all of it to show how their reporting affects change. So we shifted our emphasis to really focus on their banner reporting, their marquee reporting, and really demonstrate its power to affect real change, but then also deliver that message in high-profile cultural moments where that reporting makes the most sense. That started with late 2017, when they broke the story on, obviously, Harvey Weinstein's assault allegations, along with The New Yorker, two big high-profile pieces. We knew that Hollywood had not gotten together since this happened in late 2017, and so we created a spot specifically for the Golden Globes, which came before the Oscars, that year, where Hollywood would actually get together for the first time. We knew that this would be sort of top of mind during that broadcast and presentation. We wanted to make sure that we underscored the role of journalism and specifically New York Times reporting in that moment.
Fun little fact, broadcasters absolutely hate it if you don't have music at the beginning of things. So literally they will, for the most part, push back because everyone thinks it's broken. So they sort of yell at their TV. But there was something important about starting off in silence. And it's interesting, the art direction, we sort of, it really became a tool to show impact and to create impact and give a voice because if you think about watching one of these big one of the few last live tune-in events, let's say the Oscars, the Grammys, maybe the Golden Globes, the Super Bowl, Game of Thrones. You're just bombarded sonically and visually. It's just everything is whoa. So there's something really powerful both in this one and the first one, the very first spot about starting very starkly. And it's something that we tried to maintain. So this was all under the banner, as Nick mentioned, as The Truth Has a Voice. So that was sort of the evolution of where we sort of taken truth. So at the beginning, again, it was sort of hard to find. But ultimately, it was, if you think about the New York Times, this is the place that truth has a voice, and it has it in the Times. It has an ally and has an ability to impact the world, even when people are being sort of marginalized. So we'll quickly roll through a couple of other spots to hit some topics. I think you guys probably all understand at this point that there's been a big link between football and other sports, and concussions and CTE and degenerative brain disease. The New York Times was like it's very interesting to talk to them about this because they have sort of your quintessential sports reporting as well, but they also have, sort of hard-hitting, pardon the pun, investigative journalism around sports. That's a terrible pun that wasn't actually intended. So it's interesting to hear them talk about this, and we debated a lot about, should this next spot come out like around the Super Bowl? Should it be in the Super Bowl? Would they even let us put it in the Super Bowl?
Yeah. Do we want to be the
downer?
The Debbie Downers that shows exactly.
Yeah. It's like you do talk about do people want this when they're eating guacamole?
But we thought it was important.
Yes, they do.
We thought it was important to show up anyway and remind people of the toll and the cost of America's holiday, essentially.
So in this case, those were all headlines. That just, for those of you who don't know, told the story of Junior Seau, fantastic player for the Chargers. And it was sort of went from the sort of beginning of his career all the way sort of sadly past his death into sort of the repercussions and the role that Truth and the Times have had in bringing light to this issue. Mm-hmm. And then another one was around International Women's Day, and this one was interesting. It's like, you always try and, with the Times, be, again, boisterous about what they do and be proud of it without overstepping their role. But at the same time, it is a subscription model, so you want to sort of continue to remind people that they provide value, that they're unique. And one thing that's unique about the New York Times is actually their dedication to reporting on women's issues. It happens in sports and sort of general reproductive health, and also just all the issues, and they've sort of been at it for quite some time. So they wanted to do a spot that sort of just highlighted that in a really simple way. Again, giving voice to another issue.
Yeah, but again, we scrutinize the product. And the product there's something really indelible and iconic about the lead sentence of a New York Times article. It gives you the city the location where it occurred, and then it has a really provocative, interesting opening statement that just feels sort of quintessentially New York Times. And so that was the element of, again, the product itself that we wanted to play with here. So that one was supposed to have sound. Yeah, something happened there. But sort of the impetus for this, and you know, it's gruesome, a lot of those opening sentences, but they said to us, you know, a lot of times when we think about sort of women's rights, we think about Western women's rights in America and Europe and sort of first world countries. And so what they really wanted to highlight was International Women's Day, making it truly international and telling, and, you know, showing that they go to far-flung places and tell these stories where, you know, they're fighting for the most basic rights imaginable, and that it's important to them to tell these stories as well. So that was a lot of the first year stuff that we did. We didn't move on, but 2018 essentially presented a bigger, sort of more existential challenge to the New York Times. It's called, a lot of people call it the Trump bump. That's not necessarily the case for the New York Times, but when Trump was elected, it was a boon for all journalism, as people were sort of, you know, looking for the truth and credible sources in a time when, you know, it felt like they had lost sight and sense of what was actually happening in the world. When that sort of dissipated, we started, you know, we saw some interesting research and sort of reframed our challenge a little bit more to something that, you know, we don't want to be reliant on what's going on in politics to drive subscriptions. We want to make the case for paying for quality journalism forever, you know, and not, you know, just in high-profile election moments. You know, the truth is journalism faces a much bigger threat than fake news, which is the model is fundamentally broken. The transition from print to sort of the early stages of the internet with blogs and all of that sort of content and digital advertising revenue, and now, you know, social media and these sort of big digital companies, again, hoovering up all the digital ad sales. You know, a lot of these companies don't have a working model anymore, which is why you got to things like clickbait and, you know, traffic and, you know, traffic monitoring and headlines that perform. And that's just fundamentally at odds with what the New York Times is all about. They don't do things for page views. They don't do things for clicks. They do it because these stories are worth reporting, which is really inspiring, but challenging in a lot of ways. They were one of the first companies to move to a digital subscription model. The problem is the biggest threat to the free press, the underpinning of our democracy, is for a generation, you know, we've expected it to come free. And like I mentioned, the New York Times operates on a different business model. It was one of the first legacy newspaper companies, media journalism companies to pivot to a digital pay subscription model, to put things behind the paywall, to actually value and place a value on the things that they report. They are the standard bearer in the industry. So if the New York Times can't do it, you know, no one can. But they've steadily evolved it over the years, sort of weaning people off sort of the print subscriptions or the expectation that it comes free through ad revenues and cookies and all that sort of stuff, to really make the case of paying for journalism. What we recognize is that, you know, that disconnect between what you sort of read on your phone, you check the New York Times headlines and all of that, there's no understanding of all of the things that go into what it takes to actually publish it. Again, it's a worldwide network of reporters on the ground telling these stories, you know, cabling them in, editors, fact checkers, photographers, all of that sort of stuff to get to truly quality journalism. And what a lot of people don't know is that the New York Times invests in their journalism. So they give their reporters the time, the space, the money to travel all around the world and tell these stories because, again, they believe that they're worth telling, that finding the truth is part of their core mission. They do it not to, again, drive subscriptions. It's not their mission. They do it for their readers because these stories are important to their readers to know, to understand, to internalize, but it's also really important for society at large. Again, if the New York Times was not able to do this, nobody would. There would be a complete vacuum and these stories would not get told. So we set out to change essentially an entire generation of ingrained behavior about the value that we place on news. Obviously, we value news, but do we value it monetarily to the point where we'll subscribe to it when we're already paying for Netflix, when we're already paying for Spotify, when we're already paying for so many other things, how do we really underscore the importance that journalism, quality journalism, is part of their content consumption, their content diet that's actually worth paying for? People value the New York Times. We're not saying that we had to make the case that the New York Times is great and you should love us for these reasons. They already check us, they already come to us, they already value what we do. They're happy we exist, but they've just really never considered paying for it. It's just not part of their consideration set. It's not part of their sort of value equation about what they get out of journalism. So we needed to get essentially our readers. We have, New York Times has a ton of readers monthly. I mean, it's one of the most heavily trafficked news sources in the world. We needed to get people to sort of recognize what they get out of it by showing them everything it takes to actually produce the thing. And specifically certain qualities of our reporters and what's inside of them and what it takes for them to be able to track down, pursue the truth in the face of people who want to hide it from you, people who lie to your face, people who obfuscate and sort of avoid the uncovering of the truth. It takes tons of stuff, going into war-torn places, going up against foreign governments, going up against massive corporations. All of these things require a sort of perseverance and doggedness and courage and fearlessness that's inside every single one of these reporters. And these are, again, amazing people. And we just really wanted to show all of that that goes behind every headline. So when you're scrolling through your New York Times app, you understand that there was so much that went into the thing that you just scrolled by. And that's how we
got here.
Yeah, that's how we got here.
So the truth is worth it is probably the purest encapsulation of what we've been building to, for a couple reasons. One, there's a lovely sort of duality to the term. It is worth it as Nick just mentioned, all the things that what the journalists do to get to a story and to get to that headline, they see worth in doing. These people are, they're true believers in that, thankfully. And then also, as Nick mentioned, in the same reason why you pay for HBO or why you pay for Netflix is because it's worth it, because the quality of product that they provide is worth it. So there's something really nice about that. Secondly, and we'll get to it in a second, from a stylistic and creative standpoint, we've sort of been inching along with some sort of very simple and ownable assets that we've been sort of, as Nick said, deconstructing and sort of reconstructing in different ways. So the use of white, the use of type, the use of black, the use of photography, the use of audio. And this is the first time where it sort of like all came together in one, and along with moving image, to sort of tell the story of everything that went into that headline. And it was a really amazing sort of journey to go on. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you and then we can talk about it. to show one before we sort of talk a little bit more about the craft is because it's better to see it before I try to explain some of the things. So what we did is we actually worked backwards from the headline, and I think that is evident, but you have to understand how hard it was to sort of tell a story that had to lead somewhere and end somewhere specific. And we can wait. No, it's fine. Also sort of capture like multi-facets of the story. So Hannah literally had to fake an illness to ditch her Myanmar handler. And basically was only able to actually break this story because of all the things that she did. And I think the device is really beautiful because it allows you to, in an interesting way, tell the story, but also end up on something very simple, which is the headline. So that's the first one. We'll show a couple more.
There's been reports that you are considering separating children from their mothers at the border.
Only if the situation requires it.
So if you thought the child was endangered, that's the only circumstance to which you would separate.
Can't imagine doing any otherwise.
It's Caitlin Dickerson from the New York Times calling you back.
You get your first class.
Caitlin Dickerson, see. I'm an immigration reporter here at the Times.
This isn't the only case.
Please get in touch as soon as possible.
I know that's not true.
It's Caitlin Dickerson here at the Times.
We can talk. I didn't my phone. I like your house. And the shelters really don't know what to do with them. Very little documentation. I know that's not true.
I'm an immigration reporter here at the Times. Deadline is made tomorrow.
But I have this number. I can just tell me if you see this number. I have to confirm it. There's another person in case I confirm it.
So that one is interesting. We did this process with like an eye to what is important culturally in society, and also what the New York Times felt like reporting-wise, both represented their dedication and doggedness and perseverance, but also with an eye to sort of ensuring that people understood that worth can also be measured in the societal impact of stories. So we don't need to obviously get into it, but this reporting was one of the key things that helped actually draw attention to the detention policy at the southern border. So the sort of impact of this is obviously felt far beyond something that we could just put on a screen. It also ensured that we were trying to get in front of stories, and also ensure that we were looking at stories that we know would sort of come back up. So human rights is one that is very important to the New York Times. Immigration is a very important and complicated topic. And then the next one is ISIS, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
ISIS was something that continued to sort of flare up and was just an amazing representation of the absolute lengths that this journalist meeting went to. I think a couple other quick notes on these. Everything was fact-checked with not only the editors, but also the reporters on these. So it was a really interesting process because on the next one, we went back and forth. And this is very hard when the reporter that you're dealing with is like, oh, I'm in Syria. Oh, I'm in Lebanon. Oh, I will be literally out of cell coverage because I'm in Kashmir. Like, to get like, we went back and forth over like the use of certain words down to the point of like how you describe explosive powder. What is the right terminology that is sort of faithful to her reporting, but also like makes sense creatively. So it was just, as a, you have creative directors and you have clients, and then this is like a whole new level. But it was actually a really interesting, amazing process to go through. And it also resulted in the reporters being proud of the work we created.
Yep.
Here from the New York Times.
Yeah. I'm trying to understand the ideology of ISIS.
How does ISIS prepare you to kill people?
You have to know how to slice the head off. The blood was everywhere.
You didn't question that?
I didn't know. But what the hell did I just do? It's poison.
Iraqi forces have launched a fresh attack on the
Just go straight down this one.
Yeah, we'll go through two more real quick.
I am really worried. I am going to take charge. Somebody had gone through all of my stuff.
I'm there today with a show really
Why it's worth showing those last couple is what was interesting is one, we could make them at varying degrees of length, and actually what doesn't get referenced here, which is something that we work with the Times a lot to do, is ensuring that we're creating campaigns that have elements that can sort of show up in all channels. So what was sort of, again, not shown here, but works really lovely with this campaign is it works in something as simple as like, 15 seconds where you're actually really just showing the imagery and then the last 3 lines, or it works in a vertical content because you can sort of scale the way that the type works. So it's important for us, especially with the Times, which is such a sort of fidelity to quality and to taste, that we were able to ensure that like we showed up on social channels or Instagram stories in a manner that sort of reflected the quality and design capabilities of the New York Times themselves.
Yeah, it's nice to think that media plans allow you to run all these long form versions is what we're showing you, just because, well, they're the long form versions and they're better. Yeah, I mean, when we're increasingly being forced to put things into 6-second mid-roll, it's really important to think about all the sort of brushes at your disposal to be able to tell a story in a sound off, scrolling through Twitter environment where you can get the point across without requiring them to be glued to their phone. So the text, the visual imagery works really well together to really capture attention that way.
Yeah, I mean, we can skip this really quickly. We went, to us, it was a sort of a completely new way to show the value of journalism and condense, like, sometimes months and years worth of reporting into a few minutes. As I mentioned, literally everything that goes into these were truthful and were based on immense conversations with the journalists, fact-checking and reading the stories over and over and over and over again. This is really interesting. I sort of mentioned this at the beginning and gave a nod to it, but while they don't like talking about themselves, they also, for the longest time, there has been a real sort of like separation of church and state between marketing and the newsroom, as there should be.
Marketing needs to look very much like marketing. If you wade into any of the waters of what could be perceived or even remotely look like editorial, you get your wrist slapped for that. They don't need marketing as much as marketing needs them. So there is a bit of cautiousness for a marketing department that might has the potential to sensationalize or sort of stretch the credulity of what they're actually doing, which is reporting the facts as objectively as possible.
But I think what we've shown is that they may not need us to actually do their jobs, but they actually need us to bring in subscribers. And I think that was a powerful tool that we could show them, that we could faithfully and with respect show the quality of their work and do it in a way that they were proud of. So much so that they actually started pitching us stories, which was pretty weird. And certainly a lot weirder because it was like sort of a big deal to us, but to the marketers over there it was like climbing Everest. They would sort of ring us and be like, the newsroom wants to do a story on this. And you'd be like, well, that doesn't make any sense, but I'm glad they want to, and we'll start working with them closely. This I already mentioned. This is, funny enough, transcripts of one of the meetings that we had with Rukmini, where these are the notes in which we had with her as we went through it. And that's how we got to say everything I mentioned. And it didn't mean that we had to be sensitive about certain things. And one last sort of anecdote about this process was ISIS. The ISIS film was the first one finished and the last one to come out because we had to wait for Rukmini to come back from Iraq. There's still a lot of sensitivity around the sort of removal of certain things for the reporting. But ultimately it was worth it. That sort of sounds like a weird way to just end. But it is ultimately worth it because when you hear from them what they think about, it really is important on us to faithfully bring that out. So Rukmini has said that I cover what many consider to be the worst people on earth. Most journalists covering national security speak to officials. I speak to members of ISIS themselves. It's like, that's journalism worth paying for. And that's hopefully what we tried to capture. And knowing what went into to find the truth ultimately at the end, made people want to support it. And as I mentioned, the newsroom actually wanting to play a bigger role in helping us shape the marketing campaigns.
Yeah, there's also other really important verticals to the New York Times brand. Cooking and crosswords are the two.
Fantastic.
They're incredible. I love the crossword. I don't cook much, but that's how we got to the tonality can really flex. Certain subject matter is what's most important is often the most serious and the most grave. But we also wanted to show how tonally this construct and this craft could flex to, lighter hearted, I think it was around Thanksgiving it came out, more lighthearted reporting, showing that depth and rigor, everything that it takes to cover, ISIS can also go into finding the best Thanksgiving pie.
So we made a film about pies. That's our favorite line, actually.
Yeah.
And it also allowed it's funny, it allowed the Times it's funny, the New York Times is very rarely talks about the fact that they're from New York. It's actually something that they haven't done in a long, long time. But through this campaign, they were actually able to sort of bring something that was originally a sort of film-based campaign down to something a bit more experiential. And the New York Times does actually have amazing reporting on local issues from around New York. So what they did and what we did is we decided to find places within the city that certain reporting was on or had impacted, and we created these sort of experiential storefronts that you could then go into and learn more about the story. And then we also created one film around the MTA, which is the subway, which is awful.
Nobody understands, so you know what you're talking about. The only way we'll know about it is if you tell us.
I'm going to work on a story represented as me.
And then real quickly, it dovetails really nicely with what they're doing with the weekly. Again, it's just more of an emphasis to show what goes into the reporting. And that is sort of, like the full circle of everything that we've set out to do. And ultimately, when viewers saw that the New York Times, when they saw it differently, they started to value it differently.
Yeah, so this is where the nerdy strat stuff comes in, but essentially, what good is creativity without it being effective and moving the needle for our clients? We had very specific objectives, very specific KPIs, and perceptual measures that we wanted to move the needle on, but they're really straightforward. These are just some brand health measures where people agree with the statement the New York Times has a positive impact in the world, pursues the truth relentlessly, or most importantly, is worth paying for. And we saw significant spikes in each of these during the time the campaign was in market. To boil that down, essentially there are 160 million what you would call regular readers worldwide, and we were able to shift 15 million more to be more willing to subscribe to the Times and actually see value in it. Those perception shifts obviously drove the business. So in that time, we increased subscriptions by 60% year over year. But I love this one, which is the cost to get those subscribers. The cost per acquisition actually went down 58% quarter over quarter. So that's some pretty astounding figures there. And more importantly, it's not just about subscriptions, it's also about the markets and perceptions there. And during the time the campaign was running, the one-year stock performance for the New York Times, thought to be a legacy print newspaper around for 160 years, incapable of change, all of that sort of stuff, print is dying, was actually outperforming some of the most blue chip companies in their stock valuation, including like even Netflix and Facebook, but other competitor media as well, which means that we convinced investors, ruthless people who don't necessarily care about the craft or the scruples, but do care about a return on their investment. We convinced them that the New York Times is a modern 21st century, it's worth paying for, it's a modern 21st century business.
Yeah, I mean, it also at the end of this, what this sort of encapsulates really is just, this is the sort of last slide before we have sort of 3 takeaways, is very simply, if the New York Times is a healthy organization, journalism is a healthy organization, and that's a really important thing, not just for, as Nick said, investors, but society at large. If you think about everything that we talked about at the very beginning, the fourth estate holds power to account and gives a voice to the voiceless. And if the New York Times is healthy, it means that the ability to do those 2 things is healthy. And ultimately, that's what we set out to do.
So we have a couple of, takeaways?
Yeah,
Yeah, real quick. So we've mentioned this throughout the entire presentation, but essentially we built out a really dimensional, flexible, dynamic brand that evolved over time, but was also complementary from the very first thing that we did to the latest things that we've done. That sort of dynamism comes from actually being very clear and very sure of what your brand stands for, and that's the word truth. So while it can seem, a bit daunting to take something as heady and conceptual as truth and say, make a statement about the New York Times and why you should subscribe to it, that was actually our saving grace and the thing that was actually the springboard to being able to dimensionalize the brand and make it worth it. Look at all these iterations, look and feel, text on white, the photographers on the ground, even tonality with pies. We can finish that sentence in a million ways, like that exercise we did up front. Again, takes 40 minutes at 400, love that one. Showing the product doesn't kill creativity. It's not 20 seconds of fun storytelling and then make sure you get the logo in there big and bright and how much it costs. This is essentially, all of this work is a product demonstration. That's all it is. All we are is taking the journalism, the belief in the journalism, the things that drive us, but essentially deconstructing what the finished product is, the headlines, the bylines, the impact, the reporter's journey, the story behind the story, all of that sort of stuff, and deconstructing it is the product itself. It's just new and novel ways of talking about it.
Yeah, and then I think, Nick made me put this in here. But, in all seriousness, creativity is, in service of effectiveness and gets recognized, and it has to work. The work has to work, and that's it's something that at Droga we take very seriously. If we're going to be sort of superfluous and weird, it's still in purpose of the work working, because if it doesn't, then we don't get to do more work. So it's a sort of a really simple math problem for us. So I think this is insanely boastful and slightly stupid, but the work worked, and the work works creatively, the work works effectively. I mean, none of this really matters. What really matters is the slides before, which showed the Times healthy, and that's the work working. So I think that's it. Yes, thank you.